Get on board the Bernier bus train. Come get on board the Bernier bus train. Once you hear that clickety-clack, there ain't no time for turning back. Go get on board the Bernier bus train.
Good morning, USA, and welcome to another episode of the Bernier Bus Show. Today we're talking about political unrest in other parts of the world, again, because we need to understand why people in other parts of the world are protesting. We're also going to talk about cultural relevance, and we're going to talk about how the mainstream media are unfair, unbiased, and keeping us from finding out what we need to know. We're also going to dig in a little bit. Mike Figuera is going to help us dig in to the power of mainstream media to shape our points of view. He's citing studies that show how powerfully mainstream media shape the way people think about things. So let's start with Professor Richard Wolff talking about protests around the world. He's talking about different hot spots in the country and not only what we're protesting, but how it could change our world going forward if we were willing to go even farther with our protests. So here's Richard D. Wolff.
They involve significantly larger numbers of people, which they do. In the case of Chile, 1 million people came out a week or two ago, and that's 5% of the country's population.
Whoa.
But it's also because of what the issues are and what the determination is that unites people in more and more places. And by that I mean also the voters in Argentina who just overturned their government. I mean the yellow vests in France who for 9 months have been carrying on a campaign, and so on. Here's what is the central important reality about these demonstrations. They are protests against the last 30 to 40 years of deeply worsening inequality in the incomes we earn, in the wealth we accumulate. In each of these countries, in each of these situations, tiny groups of people have become extraordinarily wealthy at the expense of the mass and the vast majority. And that's what has people angry. Not this or that effect of that inequality, not this or that injustice, unfairness, outrage that flows from it. People having to leave the country, becoming refugees and immigrants to be abusively treated somewhere else. People lacking the basic access to housing, transportation, education, medical care that we can now produce for everybody, but fail to do so because a tiny group of people capture the bulk of the wealth and deny it to the rest of us. The protests in Chile, in Lebanon, in France, and in that vote in Argentina is a protest against capitalism, particularly the kind of free market, neoliberal capitalism that was imposed on all these societies by right-wing political movements in most cases, starting back in the 70s and the 80s. They all came in promising to deal with the poverty. They failed. Promising to deal with insecurity. They failed. They made the problems worse. So the protests now prove it, and the protests now won't allow it. But here's the big question, remains unanswered. Will they once again protest only the symptom, inequality, the symptom, injustice? Or will they be willing to confront the illness itself, an economic system that rewards people with wealth by giving them the lion's share of output and denying it to the mass of people who do the work?
I'll go you one further. Will they go even far enough to dismantle the system by taking the power away from the actual people who wield it now. Let's look at the families. Let's look at the Walton family, the Gates family, the Zuckerberg family, the Bezos family, whatever old families own central banks and so on. Are we willing to remove their money from them, thus removing their power from them? And that seems to be where Bernie's going, that even Professor Wolf isn't going. Dismantling the system is more the way Elizabeth Warren talks, but these power inequities are foisted on us by real people. We know where these people live. And that's where we're really going to get serious about the problem. If we think about yellow vest movements like he's talking about and mass protests of 1 million people in the streets in Chile or Argentina with their vote to oust their government, we need to think about this in a new way. The mass protests that are happening around the world, as he says, may not do enough if we don't completely confront the disease itself. And the disease is not merely a system. The disease is the people who foist that system on the rest of the world. Now let's shift gears here to the mainstream media and how they exacerbate this problem.
The mainstream media has made it crystal clear that they do not like Bernie Sanders and they want to defeat Bernie Sanders. Now, what are they doing to try to defeat Bernie Sanders? Well, they're just pretending like he doesn't exist. And the ways that they are ignoring him are so conspicuous, so brazen, that their agenda is crystal clear. They are trying to erase Bernie Sanders from the 2020 race. And throughout the course of this video, I'm hopefully going to demonstrate to you that this is pretty painfully obvious. Now, in case you don't know, for those of you who only watch the mainstream media, Bernie Sanders is in fact surging currently, contrary to popular belief. When you look at Real Clear Politics polling averages, he's on the rise and nearly closed the gap between him and Elizabeth Warren. He also surpasses all other candidates when it comes to voter enthusiasm, with 52% of his supporters extremely excited to vote for him and 61% definitely voting for him. A new Monmouth
I wanted to say that before with Kyle Kulinski. Kyle Kulinski pointed out those same numbers. The 61% who definitely voting for him, you could say that's Bernie or bust, or Bernie or Trump, or some other version of people who will not vote for the chosen anointed DNC candidate, which we're gonna see in a minute here. But 61% is staggering. 61% are definitely going to vote for Bernie. Now, that's not exactly Bernie or bust, but that's a huge number of people. And if they're that excited about Bernie, very excited, and if they're that willing to vote for him, that almost sounds like no matter what. No corporate sock puppets, no matter what. That's how I would interpret that 61%. But that, again, you have to interpret it. That's not a clear-cut interpretation of those data.
Poll found that he's far ahead of Biden and Warren when it comes to youth voters, and also a new Reuters Ipsos poll found that voters view him as the best candidate on healthcare, the economy and jobs, immigration, and the environment. So make no mistake about it, the Bernie Sanders surge is real, but you wouldn't know about that if you watched the mainstream media, because what they're choosing to talk about is the surge of Pete Buttigieg, who on average is polling at 7%. So he's in 4th place. Now, there's been a couple of recent polls that show him doing well in early primary states, but overall, there's been endless coverage of Pete Buttigieg praising him with comparisons to Obama on CNN and MSNBC, and they also are praising Warren because they're trying to pitch her as the go-to alternative for
And why are they doing that? Pitching Warren as the alternative go-to for progressives alternative. Because they're going to use the same dirty tricks as they did last time. Pete's voter demographic supporters are similar to Elizabeth Warren's. They're overwhelmingly white, affluent, and well-educated. And so Bernie Light that's how they perceive Elizabeth. She's actually Hillary Clinton, not light. But Pete Buttigieg, he's we're going to get that from Mike in a minute. He's the alternative when Biden tanks, and we know Biden's going to tank. But it's interesting to see how they're positioning, the media are positioning these two candidates as a way to keep us from getting Bernie. They want us to come around to the idea that when they deny us Bernie, that these candidates are worthy of our votes. I'm going to debunk that in the next few minutes, but stay tuned.
Progressives during the Democratic Party primary because, of course, they don't want Bernie Sanders to win because he's the worst in their view. And when it comes to Pete Buttigieg, the reason why the media is trying to prop him up is because he's their backup plan in the likely event that Joe Biden does fail. Now, the reason why this matters, the reason why them ignoring Bernie Sanders matters, is because this has a real substantial impact on the state of the race. So if you read any social science research on the mainstream media and the effect that they have agenda-setting powers. They have the ability to raise the salience of particular issues in your mind that they think is more important. And on top of that, they have the ability to unilaterally pick and choose winners and losers in elections.
That's amazing. He goes through that really quickly. He shows the research. He shows the figures. He shows how powerful media are. I think those last few seconds of his clip could be unpacked, over a number of episodes. I hope he'll do that because the media shapes the agenda. The media help us to see things the way they want, and they ignore things they don't want us to see. That's his main point. But let's go back just for a second. See the different things the media can do to confuse us.
The reason why them ignoring Bernie Sanders matters is because this has a real substantial impact on the state of the race. So if you read any social science research on the mainstream media and the effect that they have agenda-setting powers. They have the ability to raise the salience of particular issues in your mind that they think is more important. And
that would be impeachment. They're making impeachment really important when all it is a shiny object to keep us from thinking about changing the system itself. They make Trump the problem instead of a symptom of the bigger problem. They don't want us to look at the bigger problem.
On top of that, they have the ability to unilaterally pick and choose winners and losers in elections simply by covering them a lot or not covering them.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is president largely because the media gave him $2 billion with a B of free advertising. And even if that coverage was negative, just the mere fact that they talked about him so much made it seem as if he was a legitimate candidate and a legitimate contender when he was a clown, not to be taken seriously. But since the media covered him because they prioritized their ratings over the country, well, that's the situation that we're currently in, largely due to the mainstream media. Now, Bernie Sanders is someone who they're trying to defeat by ignoring him, because if they don't talk about Bernie Sanders, then psychologically speaking, individuals who don't hear as much about Bernie Sanders from the mainstream media will just automatically assume that Bernie Sanders isn't a real contender, when he very much is in fact a contender. And when he's surging, that's when they should be theoretically talking about him the most, if they were actually fair and balanced. But we know that they're not. All
right, let's go on here. We've got another reason that the mainstream media should be covering Bernie, because he's relevant to voters he's relevant to potential voters who would not normally vote. And we've got lots of, on the rising here, the Hill rising, we've got lots of coverage over weeks now, over months now, showing how Bernie is appealing to populist voters. He's appealing to voters who are not necessarily in the wonky place that Elizabeth Warren supporters are. They're talking about a lot of swing state voters are culturally conservative. A lot of Bernie supporters are culturally conservative. And it's interesting because even as the liberals, the traditional liberals, the suburban supremacist elitist liberals are sneering at them, they're yelling at them, telling them they need to vote blue no matter who. And the people that will support Bernie mostly are independents. Most of them aren't even Democrats. Most of them either left the Democratic Party because they were disgusted, or they've never been Democrats in the first place, but they like Bernie and what he says. And this is where populism comes in, and this is where the mainstream media really has an interest in not telling you that culturally conservative Bernie supporters are just simply not going to vote for Elizabeth Warren or Pete Buttigieg. Whether you like that or not, whether you, if you want to vote shame them, if you want to shame them for their cultural conservatism, that's not going to help. They're still not going to move. You're not going to shame them into voting for Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg. It's just not going to happen. You can't talk sense into that segment of the Bernie Sanders coalition. It's never going to happen. And if you want to defeat Trump, you're going to have to, more than anything else, more than climate change, more than any of your favorite issues, if you think that defeating Donald Trump is the most important thing, you're going to have to come around to the idea that most of the voter base you need, more than half, I'd guess, in the general election, you're not going to get. You're just not going to get those voters unless you unite behind Bernie. And that really was the whole point of starting the Bernie or Bust television show, was to show you, whether you like it or not, there are far too many people who support Bernie Sanders who won't support anyone else other than perhaps Donald Trump or a third-party candidate. Let's again, just another dose. I like to keep updating you with what's going on the Hill. This is from their summary of what happened this week on their show.
Things we touched on this a few times this week, that there are different kinds of left, right? There's the economic, but there's the Medicare for all these big sort of radical economic ideas, at least by the standards of America in the last several decades. Those actually do fine. They do well. People embrace them in a lot of parts of the country that Democrats lost and need to win back. And I say this as someone who is culturally left, is economically left. I'm left on basically everything. But you do have to be more careful with the cultural issues when you have a large part of the country that disagrees with you. And it's not so much where you stand on the issue. It's how you talk about it. Do you talk about it with love and understanding? Do you talk about it with contempt? Do you put it at the center of your campaign? Do you put your gender pronouns in your Twitter profile? Or are you just there as an ally for the community and like that's clear from where you stand?
Or do you call them a basket of deplorables, which is just condescension? With love and understanding is the way to treat people who disagree with you. I have a hard time with that when it comes to sneering, snarling, elitist Democrats. It's hard for me to treat people who are so unwilling to share the good aspects of the American dream with others. I have a hard time with snarling, sneering Democrats, but I don't have such a hard time with truck drivers or with ranchers or with dock workers or warehouse workers. I kind of grew up in that setting, so I have an affinity for culturally conservative people, even though I'm a radical leftist, really, the way I look at myself now. I'm probably farther left than Crystal is, but I grew up in a more conservative setting, and I don't hate people who disagree with me, who are who hunt and fish and who live in the country and who like country music. And I don't hate people like that. I grew up with people like that. What I hate is people who pretend that they're socially awake when they're not, when they really just want to hoard what they have and they want to build a moat around it and keep out the other people with the idea that, well, somebody has to do those jobs. By virtue of my great education, by virtue of my hard work, I deserve everything I have, is what they seem to be saying. That's where I have a hard time dealing with them with love and understanding. But I still agree with what Crystal says. We need to treat people without contempt. And that's where the Democrats, including Elizabeth Warren, don't do very well and haven't done very well for a long time. And that kind of goes back to what Professor Richard Wolff said. The workers in the world are tired of being treated that way. They're tired of being left out of the American dream, or left out of the dreams that are for democracy, dreams for social justice, and so forth, for Medicare, for good health care, for all the things that we need, a healthy planet. Workers around the world are up in arms about these things. And so this love and care that Crystal's talking about will go a long way to help the Democrats if there's anything to salvage in that party.
That's what he said it best. It's chauvinism, elite chauvinism, which appeals to the Manhattan people who have true contempt for everybody else who lives in the country.
Yeah.
That's it, chauvinism. And that he's talking about Elizabeth Warren. He's talking about one of the analysts that were on their show during the week who called out Elizabeth Warren on her chauvinism.
And then you have other candidates which, they may be there on the issues, but they are certainly not talking about it like this.
I will tell you what needs to be done for you. I will tell you how and where to live. That's the condescension that's been coming from the Democratic Party for years.
Exactly. Finally, we wanted to return to our discussion with the Ask.
So that was a good combination of topics. We had Professor Richard Wolff talking about protests and how the people in our country who should be protesting probably will be soon, and why. It's a reaction against neoliberalism and against capitalism. And then we talked about the media blackout of Bernie Sanders and how that's not going to help our situation. And then we went over the Democratic elitism. So these are three topics that will not be covered in any way by the New York Times or the Washington Post or MSNBC or CNN. And so that's, again, I keep saying, subscribe to this channel, share it broadly, and all of the different information I put in the information section below the videos. Please click on those, read them, watch them, figure this out, share them broadly on Facebook, on Twitter, Instagram, wherever you share your information, because a lot of Americans, even people my age and older, are figuring out that's the only chance you're going to have of getting the real news. And the media blockade is powerful, as Mike was showing us. So keep sharing this message. Keep doing everything you can. We only have a few months to wake up the elitist Democrats, the voting class. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck with a corporate candidate in the general election, and people will stay home in droves. Or they'll vote for Donald Trump. All right, that's what I got for today. Hope to see you tomorrow. Keep on burning.
Get on board the Bernier bus train. Come get on board the Bernier bus train. Once you hear that clickety-clack, there ain't no time for turning back. Oh, get on board